Imagine sending your sister to a place that promised healing, community, and spiritual awakening, only to have her vanish as if she never existed. No body, no grave, no record of her death. Now imagine that happening not once, not twice, but 312 times over 27 years, and no one, not the police, not the government, not even the families, could prove what happened. This is the true story of how one man's relentless search for his missing sister uncovered a conspiracy so vast and so carefully constructed that it took nearly 3 decades to unravel. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand how silence can be deadlier than any weapon, and how love can be stronger than any lie. Daniel Crawford stood in his kitchen, holding a letter that had arrived 23 years too late. The envelope was yellowed, with age, the handwriting unmistakably his sister Rebecca's, loops and curves he'd recognize anywhere. But the postmark showed it had been mailed in 1998, and he was only receiving it now, in 2021, because of a postal service error that had sent it to a dead-letter office in Louisville. His hands trembled as he read her words for the 3rd time that morning. "Dear Danny, I know you're worried about me, but please don't be. The new Covenant community has given me something I never had before. Purpose, family, a reason to wake up every morning. Brother Thomas says we're building something beautiful here, something that will outlast all of us. I've never felt more at peace. I know Mom and Dad don't understand, but I hope you will. I love you. Your sister Becca." Daniel closed his eyes, fighting back the familiar ache that had lived in his chest since 1997, the year Rebecca had left their family home in Cincinnati to join what she called a spiritual community in rural Kentucky. She was 24 then, fragile and searching after a devastating breakup and a battle with depression that had nearly taken her life. The new Covenant community had seemed like an answer to prayer, a place where lost souls could find meaning, where the broken could be made whole. Their literature spoke of sustainable living, meditation, service to others, and a return to simple Christian values. For the first 6 months, Rebecca called home every Sunday. She sounded happy, healthier than she'd been in years. But then the calls became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. When Daniel and his parents tried to visit, they were turned away at the gates by polite but firm security guards who said Rebecca had requested privacy during her spiritual journey. When they demanded to see her, they were told she was in a period of sacred silence and couldn't receive visitors. When they threatened to call the police, Brother Thomas himself came to the gate. A tall, charismatic man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you. "Your daughter is safe, healthy, and exactly where she wants to be," he told Daniel's parents with a smile that never reached his eyes. "She's an adult, making adult choices. If you truly love her, you'll respect her autonomy." And because Rebecca was indeed an adult, because she had joined voluntarily, because there was no evidence of foul play, the police couldn't do anything. Daniel's parents spent thousands on private investigators who all hit the same wall. The community was on private property. Members had the legal right to cut off contact with the outside world. And without Rebecca herself asking for help, there was nothing anyone could do. Daniel's father died of a heart attack in 2003, and his mother always said it was a broken heart that killed him, not blocked arteries. His mother followed in 2011, never knowing what happened to her daughter. And Daniel, now 47 years old, had spent more than half his life searching for a sister who had vanished into the green hills of Kentucky like smoke. But this letter changed everything. Not because of what it said, but because of what it proved. Rebecca had tried to contact them. She had written, which meant someone had intercepted her mail, had controlled her communication with the outside world. And if they'd done that, what else had they done? Daniel made a decision that morning that would consume the next several years of his life. He would find out what happened to Rebecca, even if it destroyed him. He started where he always started, with the internet, but this time something was different. Social media had exploded in the years since his last serious search, and with it came something unexpected. Other people looking for loved ones who had disappeared into the new Covenant community. He found a Facebook group called Searching for Our Lost Ones, NCC Families. There were 127 members, each one representing a family torn apart by the Commune. As Daniel scrolled through the posts, his blood ran cold. The stories were all variations of the same theme. A vulnerable person joins the community seeking healing or purpose. Contact gradually diminishes, family is denied access, and then nothing. No death certificates, no bodies, no explanations, just silence. One post from a woman named Helen Garrett stopped him cold. My son Matthew joined NCC in 2004. He was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and needed insulin daily. After he joined, I tried to send his medication, but it was returned. When I demanded to see him, they said he'd been healed through faith and didn't need medicine anymore. That was 17 years ago. I don't know if he's alive or dead. I don't know if I'm a mother or if I've been grieving a ghost. Please, if anyone has information, I'm begging you. Daniel reached out to Helen, and within a week he'd connected with 43 other families. They formed a tight network, sharing information, comparing notes, and slowly, painfully, a pattern emerged. The New Covenant community had been operating since 1971, founded by Thomas Whitfield, a former insurance salesman who claimed to have received divine visions. The community grew slowly at first, attracting idealists and seekers in the aftermath of the 1960s counterculture movement. But by the 1980s, it had evolved into something darker. Former members who had managed to leave, and there were only 11 who had escaped over 50 years, told horrifying stories of psychological manipulation, forced labor, medical neglect, and complete isolation from the outside world. They spoke of members who got sick and were told that medicine was a lack of faith, of people who questioned Thomas's authority and were subjected to correction. Sessions that amounted to torture. Of children born in the community who had never seen a doctor, never attended school, never been registered with the state. But the most disturbing revelation came from a woman named Patricia Simmons, who had escaped in 2015 after living in the community for 8 years. Daniel interviewed her in a coffee shop in Lexington, and what she told him made his hands shake so badly he had to put down his cup. "They don't report deaths," Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When someone dies, from illness, from an accident, from giving up, they don't call the authorities. They have their own burial ground, deep in the woods on the property. Brother Thomas performs a ceremony, and they're buried without coffins, without markers, without any record that they ever existed. He calls it returning to the earth, and says it's more holy than the corrupted systems of man. I saw at least 7 burials in the time I was there, 7 people who just disappeared, and those were just the ones I knew about." Daniel felt the world tilt beneath him. How many people live in the community now? When I left, maybe 180, but it fluctuates. People come and go, though mostly come. Very few leave. In 50 years, Daniel said slowly, doing the math in his head. If even a fraction of members died from medical neglect, accidents, or natural causes, and none of those deaths were reported. Patricia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I think there are hundreds of people buried on that property. Hundreds of families who have no idea their loved ones are dead, no closure, no justice. And Brother Thomas, he just keeps preaching about paradise while he buries the bodies of the people who believed him." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Rebecca. Was she one of the bodies in that unmarked graveyard? Had she died years ago, calling out for her family while Brother Thomas told her that suffering was the path to enlightenment? Or was she still alive, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape? He made a decision then that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He would go to the authorities with everything he had, and if they wouldn't listen, he would make them listen. He would go to the media. He would stand outside those gates every single day if he had to. He would become such a nuisance, such a persistent voice crying in the wilderness, that someone, somewhere, would have to pay attention. The next morning, Daniel called the FBI's Louisville field office. He was transferred 3 times before he reached an agent named Sarah Chen, who listened to his story with what sounded like genuine concern. She asked him to send her everything he had, the testimonies from former members, the list of missing people, the documentation of families denied access. He did, and then he waited. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel was beginning to lose hope when Agent Chen called him back. "Mr. Crawford, I want you to know that we're taking your concerns seriously. I've reviewed the materials you sent, and I've been in contact with the Kentucky State Police. The challenge we're facing is jurisdictional and evidentiary. The new Covenant community is on private property, and we can't just raid it without probable cause. But I want you to know that we're building a case. We're looking into missing persons reports, cross-referencing them with known members of the community, and we're examining financial records to see if there's evidence of fraud or tax evasion that could give us grounds for a warrant. How long will that take? Daniel asked, his frustration barely contained. I can't give you a timeline, Agent Chen said, and he could hear the apology in her voice. But I promise you, we're not going to let this go. Daniel thanked her and hung up, but he knew he couldn't just sit and wait for the wheels of justice to turn. He reached out to a journalist named Marcus Webb, an investigative reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal who had won awards for his exposés on corruption and abuse. Marcus was interested, very interested, and within a month, he had published the first in a series of articles titled The Lost Souls of New Covenant, Families Demand Answers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The articles were shared thousands of times on social media. News stations picked up the story. Suddenly, the New Covenant community was under a spotlight. It had managed to avoid for nearly 50 years. And with that spotlight came pressure. Political pressure, public pressure, pressure that even the most well-connected organization couldn't ignore. The raid on the New Covenant community happened on a cold morning in November 2022, exactly 1 year after Daniel had received Rebecca's letter. He stood with dozens of other families behind police barricades as FBI agents, state police, and county sheriffs moved in with warrants. The operation had been planned for months, built on evidence of mail fraud, tax evasion, and, most damningly, credible reports of unreported deaths and unmarked graves. Daniel watched through binoculars as agents moved through the property, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was here, he didn't know whether to hope or to prepare for the worst. Beside him stood Helen Garrett, the mother searching for her diabetic son Matthew. She gripped his hand so tightly it hurt, but he didn't pull away. They were all holding on to each other, these families bound by loss and desperate hope. The raid took 14 hours. When the first vans began to emerge from the property, carrying dazed, blinking people who squinted in the sunlight as if they'd forgotten what it looked like, Daniel scanned every face. He saw elderly people who looked decades older than they should, young adults who moved with the shuffling gait of the defeated, children who stared at the cameras with hollow eyes. But he didn't see Rebecca. Agents had set up a processing center in a nearby community center, and families were allowed to enter one at a time to see if they could identify their loved ones. When Daniel's turn came, he walked through rows of people sitting on folding chairs, wrapped in blankets, being checked by paramedics. Some of them looked at him with fear, others with confusion, a few with something like hope. But none of them were Rebecca. An FBI agent approached him, Agent Chen, the woman he'd spoken to all those months ago. Her face was grim. "Mr. Crawford, can you come with me, please?" He followed her outside, his legs feeling like they might give out. She led him to a quiet corner of the parking lot, away from the cameras and the chaos. "We found the burial ground," she said quietly. "It's extensive. We're working with forensic, anthropologists, and cadaver dogs, but preliminary estimates suggest there are between 280 and 320 bodies buried on that property." Daniel's vision blurred. 300 people, 300 families who would never get their loved ones back, who would have to bury empty coffins or scatter ashes that weren't really there. "Did you find?" He couldn't finish the sentence. "We're going to identify as many as we can through DNA analysis," Agent Chen said. "It's going to take months, maybe years, but we will identify them. And we need your DNA, and your parents if possible, to help with that process." "My parents are dead," Daniel said, his voice hollow. "They died not knowing." "I'm so sorry," Agent Chen said, and she sounded like she meant it. "But we did find something else. Among the people we brought out today, there's a woman who says she knew a Rebecca Crawford. She says Rebecca talked about you all the time, said you were her hero, the one person she wished she could see again. Would you be willing to talk to her?" Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Agent Chen led him back inside, to a small room where a woman sat hunched over a cup of coffee. She looked to be in her 50s, though she might have been younger. It was hard to tell. Her hair was gray, her face lined with suffering, but when she looked up at Daniel, her eyes were clear and present. "You're Danny," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Becca showed me a picture of you once, years ago. She kept it hidden in her shoe, just to have something of her old life." Daniel sat down across from her, his hands shaking. "Where is she? Is she here? Is she—" The woman's face crumpled. "I'm so sorry. Rebecca died in 2006. She got pneumonia, and Thomas wouldn't let her see a doctor. He said it was a test of faith, that if she truly believed, she would be healed. I tried to help her, smuggled her water and what little medicine I could find, but it wasn't enough. She died in my arms, calling for you and your parents. Her last words were, 'Tell Danny I'm sorry.'" The world stopped. Daniel heard the words, understood them, but they didn't feel real. 16 years. Rebecca had been dead for 16 years, and he'd been searching for her all that time, hoping, praying, believing that somehow, some way, he'd find her alive. "Where is she buried?" he asked, and was surprised at how steady his voice sounded. "In the woods, on the eastern edge of the property. There's a cluster of oak trees, and she's near the largest one. I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell someone, wanted to get word out, but Thomas controlled everything. Our mail, our movements, our lives. Anyone who tried to leave was caught and punished, and after a while we all just gave up. We became ghosts, living in a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. Over the next several weeks, as forensic teams worked to excavate and identify the bodies, the full scope of the horror became clear. 312 people had been buried on the New Covenant community property over 27 years, from 1995 to 2022. The deaths were from preventable diseases, untreated chronic conditions, accidents that should have resulted in hospital visits, but instead resulted in shallow graves. There were people with diabetes who died without insulin, people with infections who died without antibiotics, people with cancer who died without treatment, and people who simply gave up, their spirits broken by years of manipulation and abuse. Thomas Whitfield was arrested and charged with over 300 counts of felony murder, fraud, unlawful disposal of human remains, and a litany of other crimes. His trial became one of the most watched in Kentucky history. Daniel attended every day, sitting in the front row, his eyes never leaving Tom. As his face, he wanted Thomas to see him, to know that Rebecca had family who loved her, who never stopped looking for her, who would make sure her death meant something. The trial revealed the full extent of Thomas's manipulation. He had convinced his followers that the outside world was corrupt and evil, that medical care was a rejection of God's will, that questioning his authority was tantamount to condemning yourself to hell. He controlled their finances, their communication, their very thoughts. And when they died as a result of his teachings, he buried them secretly to avoid scrutiny, allowing families to suffer in limbo for decades. In the end, Thomas Whitfield was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. But for Daniel and the hundreds of other families, the conviction was only the beginning of a different kind of journey. The journey toward closure, healing, and ensuring that something like this could never happen again. Rebecca's remains were identified through DNA comparison with Daniel's sample. He buried her next to their parents in the family plot in Cincinnati, finally bringing her home after 25 years. At her funeral, he read from the letter he'd received, the one that had started everything, and he added his own words. "My sister was kind, hopeful, and looking for a place to belong," he said, his voice breaking but strong. "She trusted the wrong people, and it cost her everything. But her death will not be meaningless. Because of her, because of the 311 others who died in that place. Laws are being changed. Communities like New Covenant will face stricter oversight. Families will have more rights to check on their loved ones, and people who prey on the vulnerable will find it harder to hide." In the aftermath, Daniel became an advocate for cult awareness and reform. He worked with legislators to pass Rebecca's law in Kentucky, which required religious communities above a certain size to register with the state, allow annual wellness checks for members, and report all deaths within 24 hours. Other states began adopting similar legislation. He started a foundation to help survivors of high-control groups rebuild their lives, offering counseling, job training, and legal assistance. Helen Garrett's son Matthew was not among the survivors. His remains were found in the burial ground, and DNA testing confirmed what Helen had feared for 17 years. He had died within months of joining the community, likely from diabetic ketoacidosis when his insulin ran out. But Helen found purpose in her pain, joining Daniel in his advocacy work, determined that no other mother would have to wonder if her child was alive or dead. 5 years after the raid, Daniel stood at the newly erected memorial on what had once been the New Covenant community property. The state had seized the land, and survivors and families had voted to turn it into a memorial park. 3 Hugh, Endred and 12 trees had been planted, one for each person who died, with plaques bearing their names, birth dates, and the simple word remembered. Rebecca's tree was a flowering dogwood, her favorite, and Daniel placed his hand on its slender trunk, feeling the life pulsing through it. "I found you, Becca," he whispered. "I never stopped looking, and I found you. I hope, wherever you are, you know that you were loved. You are loved, and you'll never be forgotten." The memorial became a place of pilgrimage for families, for survivors, for people who needed to remember that even in the darkest places, even after the longest silence, truth has a way of emerging into the light. The New Covenant community was gone, its buildings demolished, its toxic legacy dismantled. But in its place grew something Thomas Whitfield never anticipated: a community of healing, of support, of people who refused to let suffering have the final word. Daniel never remarried, never had children of his own, but he considered every survivor he helped, every family he supported, every law he helped pass to be part of his legacy. And Rebecca's. He lived to see the conviction rate for leaders of abusive groups increase, to see awareness spread about the warning signs of high-control organizations, to see fewer families torn apart by the kind of manipulation that took his sister from him. On the 20th anniversary of Rebecca's death, Daniel sat beneath her tree in the memorial park, reading aloud from a journal she'd kept before joining the community, passages her friend had managed to save and give to him. In it, Rebecca had written about her dreams, her fears, her hope for a better life, and in the final entry, dated a week before she left for Kentucky, she had written something that brought tears to Daniel's eyes every time he read it. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know this: love is stronger than fear, truth is more powerful than lies, and somewhere, even in the darkest night, there's always a light waiting to guide us home. I'm going to find that light. I have to believe I will." Rebecca never found that light in the New Covenant community, but through her brother's love, through his refusal to give up, through his determination to turn tragedy into change, she became a light for others. 312 people died in silence, forgotten by the world but not by the ones who loved them. Their names are spoken now, their stories told, their memories honored, and in a world that too often looks away from suffering, that's its own kind of victory. The victory of remembering, of refusing to let the vulnerable be erased, of insisting that every life matters, every loss deserves acknowledgement, and every person deserves to be brought home. The secret of the Kentucky Commune was silence, but in the end, love spoke louder.